Morning, everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar. We're going to start off 1 minute past the hour. I'm conscious that people have got meetings they're closing up on, and also probably just settling down for their second or third cup of coffee on today, which is a wonderful sunny day. Well, definitely in Blackpool, don't know about the rest of the country. And Adrian, you're looking okay. It's not. Oh, it's not in the southeast.
It's not Surrey.
There.
It's stopped raining.
Oh, that's a good sign. That's a good sign there. Just before we start, just thought I'd point you to the direction that you can post any questions. So obviously this is an hour's webinar, conscious that we probably don't have time to answer everybody's question. But if you want to get ahead of everybody else and you have a burning question, please use the chat function to comment about any of the slides or any of the feedback and discussion topics that we are going to share with you, or you can post anonymously in the Q&A. Thank you very much indeed. Somebody's already posted a question. You can post anonymously in the Q&A, which is denoted by the two speech bubbles at the top or bottom of your screen. The chat to comment, we'll certainly be asking you to comment about what we're saying, can be used, and your name will be shared in that chat discussion there. So Q&A, if you want to pose a question and get there first, then that'd be fantastic. There's going to be an awful lot of people on this webinar, which is great for us. Any questions that we cannot answer during the 60 minutes that we've got together, what we'll be doing is that we'll be aggregating those and then sending those out to you thereafter there. So welcome everybody to the webinar. We'll get started in a few seconds there. And panelists, if I can ask you just to keep a track on the questions, that'd be great. And if you think you want to head any of them off at the pass, that'd be fantastic as well. Helps me. Okay, for all those who've just joined, what we're asking people to do, if you've got a burning question on consumer duty, great, welcome to this webinar. If you've got it on anything else, then you're probably in the wrong webinar then, but you can post it anyway. We'll try to answer it. I don't know what cricket scores and other such sporting activities going on, but if you want to post any question before the webinar, get in there first, because this is going to be a very busy webinar. We've got lots to share with you. You can also comment or give us feedback on the slides or anything that we share with you using the chat function. We'll also be asking you to participate in some polls, just to get a sense check of where you are as an organization, how comfortable you're feeling with consumer duty as well. So we'll be asking that shortly. Let's get underway. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on this webinar on consumer duty. It's closer than you think. And this is a webinar channel with Elephants Don't Forget and also Hogan Lovells, our guests on this webinar, where we actually discuss with subject matter experts and leading authorities all the questions, all the challenges that keep you up at night as individuals and organizations working in financial services. I'm Philip Allen, and this is a 60-minute webinar. We've got lots of time for Q&A, so please do participate by interacting with this webinar. They're delighted to be joined by two of my colleagues here, Adrian Harvey, CEO of Elephants Don't Forget, and Frank Brown, Senior Director of Hogan Lovells as well. Before we begin, we just this is just the housekeeping side of things. Q&A, which some of you, 5 of you, are using at the moment. Chat function for any comments, as well as getting involved and interacting with our polls. We'll also be asking you if you want to sign up for forthcoming webinars, thought leadership on consumer duty, and all other regulatory issues in the webinar at the end as well. But we thought we'd cover off the key main discussion points here, and you'll see these in the narrative and also the sign-up details that you receive prior to the webinar. We're going to talk about approaches to successfully implementing consumer duty. We're talking about how to keep compliant with consumer duty, the board's responsibility, and also the importance of the first line. If there's anything else you want us to cover, again, please use the Q&A chat function as well for you to interact with us. But we thought we'd kickstart off by asking a very simple poll question. And I'd like to invite our audience as well as our panelists to participate in that. And you'll see on your screen, hopefully now, poll question. In preparation for the new consumer duty, you have started to, and it'd be great to know which of the key elements that you started to actually get involved with. Is it assembling a project team? Is it prioritizing the areas either with the biggest impact? And we'll talk about that later. Is it securing board sponsorship? Or is it careful consideration to costs of compliance and implementation? Is it reviewing current firms' level of MI and data to evidence good customer outcomes, training your staff on the new requirements, or basically you haven't started? No judgment. This is an anonymous poll. They're just going to get a sense check. And Adrian and Frank, what's the mood music currently in the marketplace towards approaches to consumer duty, where people have started, where people need to start, and where they are in that journey?
I mean, what we're seeing is just looking at the poll, what people are saying there. And I think, yes, they're sort of assembling the project team, getting ready for it, starting to think about it is probably where most people are. And the big curveball, obviously, when the final rules came out, was the October milestone requirement. So people are definitely focused on that as the time sort of gets very close to that at the moment. Not many people realistically that far down the line in terms of the actual development and implementation at this stage.
Yeah. And
Same page.
sorry, Adrian.
Same page. I'd say a lot of firms working very hard towards that deadline, but equally we speak to firms who don't see a big difference between what they're doing today and what consumer duty demands of them. So I see a bit of a polarization. See quite a lot of big brands working very hard to get themselves ready for that deadline, but not much beyond that, and a bunch of firms not taking any action.
So there's no surprises there, Frank, when you see 70%. Yes, we've got top answer there is assemble a project team to conduct a gap analysis between current processes and the new rules.
Yeah, I think that is pretty much where people are. I mean, just to sort of echo Adrian's point there, that degree of perhaps inertia and complacency is a challenge within firms. This idea that people thinking it's just TCF 2.0, we don't need to do much, we don't have to make many changes, it's not going to impact our world. Overcoming that barrier, getting people moving, getting people motivated is a big challenge, definitely.
So that people still think that this is TCF in disguise, or we're doing this already.
Yeah, there is still that sort of inertia, still that, I mean, I don't know if complacency is a fair word, but still that barrier to get over of the recognition that, as the regulator says explicitly, this is beyond TCF, and you start drilling down into the sort of questions that are in particularly things like the final guidance, and we'll explore that a bit in a minute. If you actually read those questions and think, honestly, can we answer that? Would we be comfortable sitting in front of the regulator and giving a response to that? It starts to become a lot more real to people.
We've asked a follow-up question to you, and we've asked you what will be your key challenges in implementing new consumer duty. Fascinating answers already coming in on this. And so number one being gathering data in target markets, conducting a gap analysis, providing MI to your board or management and the evidence required and demanded by consumer duty, securing budget for the work that needs to be undertaken, and number five, developing a culture. And if there are any others that we haven't covered off, just drop us a note in the chat or anonymously in the Q&A, which is denoted by the two speech bubbles on the top or bottom of your screen there. This is fascinating. Not because I'm just a regulatory nerd, but I also think that, and Frank, that really interesting where firms are probably getting quite stuck on, if that's the appropriate word to use.
Yeah, and you know, it's good to see that. I think it's just ahead at the moment, the cultural point and that acknowledgement and recognition within firms that you know, this is not just about changing policies and procedures. This is about changing mindsets within organizations and how much of the effort will be required in, you know, I normally use the term sort of making it real to people in the organization, getting people to buy into this as a concept. Because if you don't do that step, and we'll talk about the implementation process in a moment, you're always going to be pushing against that inertia between now and July and beyond July.
So when we see that the lead answer in this, conducting a gap analysis between current process and new rules, is that what's keeping people up at night? And be basically evaluating that, bringing project teams together, and actually thinking that there's that first deadline of the 31st of October is not too far away.
Yeah, without question. I mean, you've got the sort of overarching challenge of the entire project meeting the July deadline, but that new thing that's been dropped in around the October, you know, giving the information to the board, and I think we're going to expand on that in a minute in terms of what is required within that board pack that goes out there. I think the one that's running a little low at the minute is perhaps securing necessary budget for the work you're doing, because as you go through that gap analysis, you go through that sort of honest conversation internally, there may be some quite significant capex requirements in terms of, we need to change our IT system, we can no longer sell this product via an online journey, we will have to use more staff, we'll have to get more staff in, more call center staff to talk to our customers, we will need more staff, full stop, in various areas of the business to meet the sort of customer service requirements. That could be some real pound notes for the organization.
You're saying that
a chicken leg though, Frank, isn't it? A case of you've got to do the gap analysis. You've got to do the where are we, where do we need to be before you can go and ask for money to solve the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you'll have to have that justification to go to finance or go to the board to say, look, we need this money. But equally, it is probably worthwhile at this stage of the journey to be having those conversations and warming people up around there is potential that we will need some spend on this, rather than it becoming a surprise in a couple of months' time.
Worth saying, Frank, that on this illustration, that this is a complete paradigm shift and not a compliance change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back to it's not TCF 2.0 concept. I mean, if you look at that slide, that is the whole of your business. That's everything you do within the organization, you know, products and services, price and value, customer understanding, customer support, the outcomes, and the additional kicker of those cross-cutting rules coming across the top. You combine those together, and there is that changes the way you produce your product, how you price your product, how you take your product to market, how you service your product afterwards. So that is the ball game basically for the entire organization.
Yeah, and one of the key verticals that you've got there on the cross-cutting rules is that that phrase that we're going to hear a lot of, and it's mentioned 56 times in the final rules, which is responsibility to prevent foreseeable customer harm. I mean, that's huge, isn't it?
That is the one that I certainly focus on with firms. I mean, everything's important, of course, but that foreseeable harm one is the real sort of unexploded bomb within the process, because hindsight is 2020. Once something goes wrong, it can be, or it looks obvious why it went wrong, but prior to that, it's often difficult. So this is, again, you talk about a sort of paradigm shift. This is the big shift of much more proactive, much more forward-looking, not just fixing things after they've gone wrong, after the risk has crystallized. You get your customer complaints, you address them, you do your root cause analysis, you make your changes. Much more of the thinking and sort of hypothesizing within the organization of, where could this go wrong? Where could the issues happen? What could be the customer outcomes? Where could be the failures? Thinking internally, but also inevitably across this, having that dialogue, having that consideration, talking to the customers, understanding whether the customers understand the product or not, whether the customers think it's reasonable or not. has got a much more increased load, and it touches on things like SMCR and reasonable steps in terms of that challenge to individual SMFs if things do go wrong about what were you doing, why did you not think this was going to happen, what was your consideration, what level of insight did you have going forward. So foreseeable harm, I think, is definitely going to be the key one for firms.
Adrian, on that, the FCA is expecting firms obviously to be proactive in understanding and recognizing and preventing foreseeable harm. That's a critical reliance that firms will need to place on the training and competency of their staff to address that and to see it off before it comes to pass.
Undoubtedly, I like the way Frank framed it, and in our terminology, this is about lead and lag indicators. Yeah. And I see a lot of firms, it's not a criticism, it's a statement of fact. I ran some very big regulated firms. You work with the information or the data that you have available to you at the time. Almost all of that data was lag data, meaning that we've already made the mistake. Yeah, it's already happened. Here is the outcomes. And for me, consumer duty, one of the fundamental challenges to how businesses operate under this legislation is the requirement to get a handle on lead indicators. Yeah, so I want to know before it goes wrong. Yeah, what is going to go wrong? And when we start talking about people and training and competency regimes, yeah, this is it's a fundamental change in the way organizations go about this. Because if you're just relying on, well, we've trained these people, it's done, and then looking at the QA sort of processes or the complaints raised by customers, I think you're failing in your obligations under consumer duty to ensure that customers, or evidencing that customers genuinely are getting fair treatment.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely 100% agree with that. The leading indicators one is a real mindset change for most organizations, and it's a massive deficit for most organizations. I mean, it's not easy, it is hard to develop them, but without them, consumer duty is going to be a very, very difficult journey for firms.
Which didn't surprise me to see culture was joint first, or just narrowly second on that previous poll. Because you start looking at what I call a desk-based piece of work in relation to consumer duty to start with, and that's a void for most firms. How are we going to do that? And to Frank's point, it's not easy, and there's a lot of work and inevitably cost and change required of these organizations to meet this standard.
That's right. Just from an audience point of view, no, you're not going cross-eyed on this. We haven't put an extra outcome. We've just labeled it 1, 2, 3, and 5, and my typo on that. But I'm just wondering if we ask the audience about the 4, not the 5 outcomes there, which one keeps you up at night? Would you like to put a 1 for products and services, a 2 for price and value, 3 for customer understanding, or 4 for consumer support there? You can add another one if you want to make your life even more challenging than it is, if you want to. So post it in the chat there, and that will kind of like steer our conversation which one to drill down on for the rest of this session. So if you want to put a 1 in the chat for products and services, 2 for price and value, 3 for consumer understanding, and 4 for consumer support, that will be fantastic there. When we look at the requirements, Frank, it presents a number of demands and challenges, doesn't it, to firms, because meeting and addressing these 6 expectations of the regulator is a struggle.
Yeah, without question. I mean, they put their sort of shopping list of what their expectations were here, and if you go into the final guidance, there's much more granularity around the questions they're going to ask firms and the expectations, and it is a big uplift without question. I mean, if you think about first one there, rip-off charges and fees. I mean, not necessarily saying everybody's ripping off customers, but if you think of market sectors where there may be challenges, I mean, obviously high cost short-term credit, mortgages with arrangement fees, some of the investment IFA sector around pension switching charges, and particularly in the investment space, that sort of business model of charging on a percentage of the amount that the customer is switching, you know, the size of the pension pot, becomes a difficult one to justify going forwards, because the amount of effort involved in a £20,000 pension against a £200,000 pension is not discernibly different between the two. So that the fees and charges one is definitely one that's going to have challenges to firms, but equally the information provision, because again, I'm sure not people on this session here today, but if your business model is predicated on a customer not understanding what they're buying, and we know that there's been many of those instances in the past with products, then it is something that the regulator is absolutely going to focus on going forward. If you can't justify the value of the product, if you can't say why that distribution chain is in the interest of the customers as opposed to the interest of everybody in the distribution chain, that becomes a challenge as well. So going back to my earlier point, sort of across everything that you're doing, every touch point with a customer, every interaction, Consumer Duty will ask you the hard questions.
And Adrian, I mean, 2020 FCA's Financial Live Survey said that only 10% of consumers strongly agree that they have confidence in financial services industry, and 35% said that they don't think that they're necessarily being the organizations are honest and transparent in their dealings with them. So there's a long way to go to meet customer expectations. Consumer Duty basically addresses that and wants to see those numbers basically increase in terms of like the satisfaction and the expectations of customers there. Evidence is going to be critical, and data is going to be critical for firms to demonstrate to the regulator as well as to their customers that better outcomes are being achieved.
Yep, I see a parallel with what has happened in the water industry, where water companies are scored, something called a CMEX score, are scored by their customers. And then those companies are then force ranked, and the ones at the bottom have to give money back to their customers. This has transformed how these organizations have to serve their customers. And what it does, if you look at that and say, well, logically, yeah, you're going to get judged as your financial services firm, you're going to be judged much more publicly. Yeah, so newspapers will take it, will be much more interested in judge and jury type situations under Consumer Duty than perhaps SMCR, if I can say that. Yeah, it's far more newsworthy. I think the challenge for firms is that what this means, okay, if you've got an entirely online business model, okay, this comment probably doesn't work. That will be few and far between, I think, under Consumer Duty. Therefore, I think you're going to have a lot of reliance on the front line and the requirement for those individuals, relatively junior staff, having to treat every customer individually.
Correct.
Where not without necessarily a system that does it all for you, because the system doesn't do it all for you. You do need to have an adult conversation with that customer. You need to be competent in your role, not just trained to do a job and click a button. You need to be competent to advise that customer. And that isn't where employee training competency regimes have been for the last 10 years. They've been in the lowest cost race to the bottom, lowest cost to deliver, a tick in a box. So somebody posed the question in the chat anonymously, it's perfectly fine. How does this affect training and competency regimes? I think it actually means that training and competency regimes need to deliver up their game and deliver against the title.
Yeah, exactly. Frank, there's the first hard stop, isn't there, on the 31st of October. Are boards prepared?
No, I'd have to say not. Boards and firms not prepared. I mean, go back to my sort of earlier point. Yes, this did appear in the final rules. It wasn't trailed previously, but equally, there is a lot of work to do, and most firms realistically are a bit behind the mark on where they need to be on this one. And as you just flipped over on the slide there is a lot to be done, because an awful lot of organizations are thinking very much around, I just need to give a Gantt chart to the board, I just need to give a project plan to the board with some dates on and some milestones, and that'll be fine. Not really, no, because the regulator is quite clear in their guidance around that expectation of discussion, challenge, assessment by the board, by the senior management. And if they've only got a one-pager, that is not tenable. It's not going to happen. So this idea, and this is our sort of concept, and yes, it's idealized, but I think firms should look at it building up the elements. So starting with the scoping idea, which is incredibly important, because for some firms it'd be relatively simple, single product, relatively new to the market. But if you've got a multi-product organization, legacy products, a wide range of activities that you're doing, what's in scope, what's not in scope can be quite challenging. And I saw there's a few questions on that in the chat around, I'm this firm, does it apply to me, kind of thing. So knowing what's in scope, because what you don't want to do is suddenly realize in April next year, oops, that product line is actually in scope. So that's problematic. Knowing what good looks like, and we've been talking about this in terms of it's not TCF 2.0, the uplift, etc., because that gives you the sort of size of the effort that's required. This is what we need to do. Combine that with a gap analysis, where we are on that journey. Unless the board's got a feel for that and understanding of that, it's very difficult for them to look at a plan and say, okay, fine, that's reasonable to achieve those objectives. And equally, on the other side of it, who's going to do this? Who in the firm's got the competencies, who in the firm's got the expertise, who's got the capacity to do this over the next time period is another important question the board should be asking.
Adrian, you've been a CEO, main board director of global and international energy companies. What would you be expecting as a board member, your head of compliance, chief risk officer, even an internal audit to be presented to you on the 31st of October?
Yes, I guess evidence is what any board's looking for. They're wanting clarity. I guess looking at this, I would draw a ring around that and say culture. So all of these are functional things that we've got to do. Okay, we've got to sort, monitoring and oversight, roles and responsibilities. Who's going to do this? Right. All around this, the big problem here, Philip, is consumer duty is about the culture of our business, how we engage with our customers. It's all of this chunk up that's missing. So I would be challenging whether it's a one-pager, Frank, or whether it's 500 pages death by report. I would be challenging, well, where's the cultural answer? How are we going to change our business? Because our business has to change in order to comply with this legislation, not just our products. How are we going to change our business? That's what I'll be asking.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And we've sort of talked about it before, the idea that culture is what happens when compliance or senior management isn't in the room. So if you're going to actually run this, embed this on a BAU perspective, if you haven't answered those cultural questions, it is not going to get beyond a policy change, realistically.
I'd be leading with it.
Yeah.
If I'm expecting the regulator to, if I've got any thought that the regulator is going to see that plan, chapter 1, culture, because everything else sits underneath that. So if that's not, as a regulator, I'll be looking at saying, how are you going to address the culture of your business? Unless, of course, you believe your culture is already perfectly aligned to that consumer duty.
We're going to talk about this in a bit more detail, but project initiation that we've got on the screen requires the mobilization of the whole business, Frank.
Yeah, absolutely. because this will touch all areas, and I think we've got a slide next which expands on that. But in terms of that engagement and buy-in from the first line is incredibly important. I mean, it goes to Adrian's culture point and the points we were talking about earlier about the making it real to these people, because they're the risk owners, they're the people with the sort of skin in the game in terms of making things happen for the customers. And asking those hard questions around who's going to do this, do they understand it, have they got the capability to do it, have they got the inclination, and drilling down into those sort of clear responsibilities. So giving people the responsibility, but also informing them that they've got the responsibility as well. I mean, we've seen a bit of challenge with some organizations where they put together a great Gantt chart and a great responsibility matrix, but they don't actually have the conversation with the people on the matrix. Yes, so aspirational rather than achievable. Yeah,
but it's worth it noting that consumer duty, yes, it asks for a consumer duty champion, but it also, consumer duty can't be delegated by senior managers, can it? Yeah, and so that's where absolute alignment with the first, second, and third line is critical.
Yeah, without question. I mean, you mentioned there briefly the idea of the consumer duty champion, and it is. I can see why the regulator's coming from, but I think there's a danger within that of assuming that the consumer duty champion is going to be the driver of this project and is going to be the solver of this project. I mean, the expectation is they're going to be a NED, independent NED. Their role is the sort of the voice of the customer on the board, the challenge on the board, as opposed to getting down into the weeds and actually making changes within the organization. So our recommendation and our conversation with people is having those senior management functions or heads of within those operational areas absolutely on the hook and absolutely clear that they are going to be delivering these changes.
We talked about it before, Adrian, critical role and the importance of the first line in delivering effective competency, but also driving those customer outcomes that the firm wants, as well as the customer wants, as well as the regulator wants. In your experience of delivering change programs within financial services firms, is that easily done, easily managed? And if so, by whom? Who's driving that?
Yeah, so I'm just going to take exception to project, the word project. Yeah, so I hear a lot of firms talk about they'll have a consumer duty project or piece of work underway at the moment. In my opinion, if you're looking at this as a project, you've missed the point. This is a program. Yeah, it needs to be macro level, and this is why I think some firms have misunderstood what consumer duty is. They're looking at it as, you know, a little bit more than we already do. For me, this is at a program level. It is a fundamental mind shift. So does that? I'm saying don't look at it don't look at it a line item, almost ticking these things. I've got to get these things done because consumer duty says I've got to get these things done. For me, this is a program, and it needs to be owned. Someone made the point about the board's not engaged. Well, trying to get the board's attention on this. It's a program that's got to be owned by the board and cascaded through the organization, and appropriate support given to, I've got to say, the first line, who's actually, once you've done your product, once you've done the work that Frank articulated so well about changing your products and services, yeah, then the rubber hits the road when your customers start engaging with your first line. They need the appropriate support to do that.
Frank, in your article on LinkedIn, you talk about a top-down, like Adrian's saying, but also a bottom-up, which leans itself towards a program rather than a project there. Just talk us through what you mean by that.
Yeah, I mean, there's no sort of one size fits all for consumer duty, but this methodology is one we've been talking to firms about and has proven useful. It's the recognition, and this is often more appropriate with firms that've got multiple product lines, that if you start from the policies and procedures and the terms and conditions of an individual product and sort of work backwards from there, you will never get this finished at all. So the concept of sort of top down, bottom up is starting from the top around a sort of triage concept of most firms will know fine well what the problems are in the organization. First line will know, second line will know, third line will know around products that are not fit for purpose, processes that are not working, communication with the customers. So getting those early wins in, and also reflecting those common processes across multiple product lines and multiple systems, because you go back to the sort of cross-cutting rules concept, you know, not thinking about this as a siloed exercise, thinking about this as Adrian was talking about, that sort of transformation of the whole organization. And building that momentum. So getting those early wins, getting the process moving for internal sort of motivation, but equally if the regulator starts having conversations with you, you can see that movement, but inevitably recognizing the fact that there will need to be that granularity from the bottom. So I mean, my colleagues in legal are doing a lot of this work at the moment. Individual terms and conditions will need to be looked at and changed. Yeah, so the two together, meeting in the middle, that's success.
We've said it's all hands on deck, and the role and importance of, we haven't talked about it yet, but internal audit is going to be critical in this, supporting both the business, Frank, and the board.
Yeah, absolutely. And the FCA called it out a couple of times in their documentation around enhanced roles for internal audit, and also risk as well, second line risk, which was interesting because you don't often see that reference, particularly when we're talking about customer outcomes, much more on the prudential, the financial side, you know, the controls. It is a challenge for, let's be honest, most internal audit functions, because traditionally, and again, this is a generalization, but most of them not over focused on the customer side of things, the outcome side of things, those sort of softer principle based elements, which obviously this is. So there will need to be that change of mindset, that education with the internal audit colleagues around, you are now part of this process, and within your audit plan, within your individual audits, you're going to need to be thinking much more about these softer customer outcome elements. So you've got the kind of BAU of internal audit as this becomes embedded. Equally, I think there's a valuable role for internal audit during the course of the program as well, in terms of, you know, validation, assessment. Has this happened? Has this milestone been met? Are we going to achieve the objective? So they can form part of that role as well.
Adrian, I see internal audit moving, as Frank said, from a traditional reporting approach to a data and MI-led approach that is in working in real time with MI, that they can glean from the first line and the second line to drive not only decisions, but also give oversight and insights throughout the firm to senior managers.
Yep. For me, this is about lead and lag indicators again. This is about, where is that information today? How does internal audit get a handle on genuine people-based risk arising from the first line? What are they using? What data are they using to do that? At the moment, I suggest that's probably almost exclusively lag data, where things have gone wrong. For this to work, the data needs to be real time, and it needs to be in advance of the wheels falling off. So that's what internal audit needs: a considerably better data set, particularly around people competence. And in most firms, that won't exist. We'll point to some training that somebody did last year, or that's not going to help them solve.
I really feel this is a switch, Adrian, from a regulator that's saying basically, show me, just don't tell me, show me. And you know, that needs, going back to your cultural change and transformation, not only needs people to switch in their minds, you know, to align with the purpose of the organization, but as one commentator said, to kind of like adopt a machine line of defense to sit with, I had to get it in there, didn't I? The first, second and third line as well.
Yeah, I mean, there is a requirement. Firms will make their own minds up, won't they? Throw people at it to some extent, but there's technology out there, obviously, that can can assist significantly with achieving some of these outcomes.
Where building a customer-centric culture, Frank, is one thing, but where can things potentially go wrong when we're looking at driving implementation of consumer duty?
I mean, as you say there, it's a long way from the boardroom to the front line, and that information flow, both upwards and downwards through the organization, is incredibly important and often challenging. And consumer duty will raise the bar on that in terms of how much information needs to go up to the board, to the exco, in terms of understanding what's going on, because the board's responsibility are, you know, at the October sign off through the project, but obviously also beyond that as well, into implementation, into BAU. So reformatting what information goes up, and the second line function, particularly second line risk, which again was called out in the work the regulator did, what they're going to be doing in terms of those key risk indicators, that risk control self-assessment process, risk reporting. And it goes back to Adrian's point about the leading and lagging indicators, having those conversations with the first line risk owners around how are you going to know, how are you going to spot foreseeable harm in this organization, how are you going to know that customers are receiving poor outcomes. And again, not always a natural place for risk to be having those conversations. Risk often more focused on credit risk, liquidity risk, market risk, etc. Those sort of cleaner, you know, metrics that they can cope with, as opposed to the messier, the more subjective conduct risk, customer outcome elements.
Mm-hmm. And it pretty much starts with looking at, we've talked about culture before, but looking at the product suites and reviewing the product suites there. You've got this impact assessment that all firms are going to have to do with the products and services that they are promoting, marketing and creating.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, as people would look at it, it's pretty much a rehash of a Boston Matrix concept, but using the ideas of risk and return as your metrics. So theoretically, it is possible to sell pretty much any product to customers, provided you are spending enough and devoting enough time to controls within the organization. So what tends to happen, where failures tend to happen, is product is too risky, not enough control put against it, so customers receive poor outcomes. So the idea of this is within the customer duty journey, having those honest conversations about what does it take to sell this product effectively in the new world, and can we do it? And equally, is this product actually making any money for us? Because the problematic thing I see with organizations is very risky product actually delivering very small returns for the organization in the product portfolio. So, you know, if you've got a product which is very profitable for you, delivering a lot, you've got a lot of customers, but it requires some enhanced controls, fine, that can be costed into the process. But if it is not making any money for you and it is hugely problematic, then think about delisting it, think about allocating the capital elsewhere. So we talked about this before we started, but the idea of sort of opportunities of consumer duty, it's often hard to find opportunities, but looking at your product portfolio, looking at your capital allocation, looking at where your returns are coming from with a fresh pair of eyes, and right-sizing your approach could be that opportunity.
Would it the FCA's expectation that we have greater competition in the marketplace? Very philosophical at this stage of the game, whether it will or not. There, what's your opinion on that? Greater competition benefits to the customer or the consumer?
It can be a challenge. I mean, there can be unintended consequences where people sort of look at the market, look at the cost of control, as I was saying on the previous slide, and think, I can no longer do this. I mean, we've seen it recently in the funeral plan, prepaid funeral plan market, which has just come under regulatory control with the FCA, and huge amount of exit from that market. People just looking at it and thinking, this is not worth my time, worth my money anymore to apply these regulations. So the choice in that market massively narrowing, high cost short-term credit as well. The choice in that market massively narrowed over the past couple of years. The demand is still there, clearly. So, you know, yes, competition is important and valuable in the marketplace, but I think there will be an inevitability of people looking at their product portfolio, as I said on the previous slide, and delisting some of those products.
I think that in itself raises some interesting issues around vulnerability, because if product A is too expensive to deliver with the appropriate governance, and all the suppliers in the market delist or pull away from that product, and that product does serve almost an exclusively subset of the vulnerable market, that's a market failure. So I get I get the sentiment behind consumer duty, and I completely support that. And as a consumer myself, I want that. Unintended consequences, I think, was Frank's phrase. We get to a point where we are isolating parts of the society because the products that have been sold to them are deemed to be too expensive to deliver. That's a bad outcome.
Yeah, and just a follow-on point, which was in the rules, but some people have not necessarily picked up on it. If you are delisting products and there may be that sort of potential deficit to customers, there is a Principle 11 expectation to have that conversation with the regulator. So, yes, I think delisting can be a good thing from a risk control perspective, but there are issues from a consumer perspective, and that potentially will need to be highlighted to the regulator.
Evidence, we've talked about that, and MI, data is going to be critical. I posted in the chat a link to the final non-handbook guidance that the FCA published about some of the data and some of the areas of data collection that firms could undertake if they want to deliver good customer outcomes. Frank, do you want to just pick up on one or two that may be a challenge, or maybe also or an opportunity that perhaps previously firms haven't explored?
We always use the word opportunity quite broadly, tongue-in-cheek, certainly. I think the customer feedback one is incredibly important, and it goes to our sort of consistent messaging. We've been talking about this idea of leading indicators. It will be very difficult in most areas for firms to justify that they're handling the sort of foreseeable harm element and the other outcomes if they're not having those conversations with customers, engaging with customers much more. I mean, so many products these days are online only. It's a cheap way of working. A lot of customers respond to it. They want to use it. App-based products. That hard question to firms is going to be, how do you know your customers understand that? Back to Adrian's point about vulnerability. The vulnerability of sort of low financial expertise is an often overlooked one. How can you honestly say your customers understand this if you haven't had that conversation with them? So the load on firms for that sort of market research, focus groups, voice of the customers is going to be higher, and is going to be part of that defense mechanism you're going to need to make sure you're complying with the regs, or showing you can comply with the regs.
Adrian, in the past, firms could demonstrate, couldn't they, to the regulator that they have all the right policies, training frameworks and controls in place, but they weren't necessarily demonstrating clearly the measures that were delivering or they could deliver to deliver fair outcomes for consumers there. That's all going to change, and that has to change under consumer duty.
Yes, you said that I see consumer duty being more than sort of products and policies. It's much more about attitudes and behaviors. Somebody in the chat was raising the point that lead indicator data was harder to get at. Yes, I don't dispute that. It is harder to get at. That said, it's not impossible. Our business deals in that lead indicator marketplace, and I just think that saying it's difficult, therefore we're not going to do it, is, and I'm not suggesting that the person who raised that question is saying that, but I'm just acknowledging that there is a way to get that data. And if I were currently running a firm and in the financial services marketplace, I would be looking at what evidence am I going to rely on in relation to my employee competence. Yeah, that's going to have that conversation with that vulnerable customer who may not be finance savvy and who has just ticked the box, yes, I agree with terms and conditions, and hasn't read them and doesn't understand them.
we've spoken, both of you, about vulnerable customers, and I've just posted in the chat a link to the FCA's paper, Finalised Guidance 21.1, on that. And in that report, hence why we've highlighted it on this webinar, is it really holds the feet of firms to the fire on 3 counts. Basically, senior leaders not necessarily having the oversight of their approach to vulnerability. Second, the MI wasn't sufficiently well developed. And 3, limited evidence of MI on what seismic shift or cultural shift that vulnerability training had for staff. The FCA certainly doesn't hold back, and that was further enhanced by, and most of you would have seen it, by a Dear CEO letter to 3,500 lenders that basically said that we are not, and I quote, not waiting for the duty to come in before we act to improve consumer outcomes. There's no messing around here, Frank, is there?
No, they are fairly frustrated, rightly or wrongly. They're the regulator, it's their view, with the way things have been going with A, vulnerable customers, B, conduct risk and TCF overall over the past years. So consumer duty is a view from them to reset this. I think the vulnerable customers one is incredibly important, and it was interesting the way round they did it, because they released the vulnerable customers first, then released consumer duty, which personally I probably would have done it the other way around, because vulnerable customers should not be a separate pillar of activity. Vulnerable customers should be absolutely wrapped into consumer duty, and in many respects is an articulation of how you're approaching consumer duty. If you're doing it well for those customers, you're probably doing it well for the rest of the customers. And from a sort of, as you were saying, what will the regulators do? How will they react? It's often quite hard to look at an organization and think where things are going wrong. I mean, I do 166 skilled person work and also M&A work, and it is quite hard to sort of understand where the problems are. But if you do a thematic look through an organization, okay, walk me through how you're treating your vulnerable customers. That cuts across governance, it cuts across MI, it cuts across training, cuts across policies and procedures. You can just go straight through an organization and find where things are wrong. So it's a real canary in the coal mine. It's a real acid test.
Yeah, and there. How do you think firms are going to react, Adrian, to the expectation now, even prior to consumer duty? Because this is not an expectation, this is actually a demand now that the regulator wants to see. And I say this as we just raised our 3rd poll question, which is whether you as an organization are basically reviewing, looking at, evidencing through the use of technology solutions to meet the regulator's expectation on consumer duty there. Adrian, do you see that the customers you're talking about are basically ramping up their response to vulnerable customers in response to the final rules from last year, or not?
Certainly from a customer point of view, it's easy for them to do with our tech. So yes, and the vulnerable customer situation, as I see it, has only got worse with the recent cost of living challenges that everyone has. I'm looking at the consumer duty point and that Dear CEO letter, and thinking that actually the first party to hold firms to account is unlikely to be the regulator. It's more likely to be your Soaraway Sun or the Daily Mail. Because unlike SMCR, which with respect, the Sun probably couldn't spell, that the consumer duty is something that really, really interests them. It's incredibly newsworthy. It's almost a thing that the Daily Mail could have a year-long campaign to support. I feel that firms are going to be exposed to trial by press when they get this wrong, and they will get it wrong. And I ran British Gas. We had more complaints you can shake a stick at, but you need to put it into the context of how many processes or transactions that you're doing. The Sun won't do that. The Sun will pick on the failures that they've been brought to their attention. So I think it's going to be an uncomfortable ride for a lot of firms.
Yeah. Without question. I mean, just to add that, claims management companies as well. I mean, the claims management companies will have read this cover to cover and underlined the sections that they're interested in. So that is going to be another pressure on firms here.
We've asked our final poll question, which is basically reaching out to Hogan Lovells and Frank Brown and his team to assist you with the regulatory deadlines there and reviewing your gap analysis, enhancing your strategy, and obviously working with you side by side through project implementation and post-implementation of consumer duty. Also speaking to elephants, don't forget of how you can use AI and deploy AI to achieve good customer outcomes, and also to register for our upcoming webinar on tick box compliance is your approach damaging your culture there as well. So if you can populate one or more of those, that'd be fantastic there. Final thoughts from you, Frank, on this. How is the regulator going to enforce consumer duty?
I mean, I never like to sort of scare people, but it is a big stick in their bag, without question. I mean, principles are always much easier to sort of challenge firms on. I mean, as I say, when I was doing the 166 work, it was often on principles that they would challenge firms. So this gives them much more broader opportunities than just saying you've not applied Conc 3.62 or something like that, which can be argued either way. So generally speaking, as soon as they start talking about principles, it means they've got some intent to do some enforcement action in the market. And back to my point, they have voiced frustration. I mean, I've had it directly, and they've put it in the press around they're not feeling things are going well. They're feeling that new products are popping up. People are not applying the expected TCF rules to those new products. So it goes back to the foreseeable harm point. That gives them a real sort of broad brush approach they can take.
I don't know if anybody wants to pose any more questions. We have 32 already, 33 in the chat now already there. Frank, Adrian, do you want to jump in on the questions, just clicking on the Q&A there, and basically in no particular order, they're jumping in and addressing quickfire round, fingers on buzzers, to be able to just address any of the questions that we have been posed by the audience.
Yes, I was just going to jump in on the back of Frank's comment there. How's the FCA going to act on consumer duty? I suspect, unfair as it may be, the FCA will also be reading the Daily Mail and the Sun, and the Sun and the Daily Mail will be picking on the largest firms, those brands that are well known because they are more newsworthy. And I suspect that, right or wrong, anything that gets raised by the Sun or the Daily Mail is going to be, you'd be stupid not to investigate it straight away.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, we've got about 33 open, which we haven't really looked at, but I think we're going to come back to people with a sort of general message around these questions, and I'll look to answer most of them. There was one about somebody raised the point that we seem to be talking about the front end distribution rather than the back end manufacturing, and yes, I think we have focused a bit on that, but absolutely there are challenges for the manufacturers, and manufacturers have got that additional kicker in the regs around they've got to get most of this done by April before they have the conversations with the distributors. So the manufacturing one has been pulled back, and they really need to be focusing on that, and that relationship between the manufacturer and distributor has always been challenging, but there must be far greater information flows going forward, or both parties are going to have problems.
Someone raised a question, are the slides available? All of this is available, and a recording of the webinar is available to everybody.
Are group products in scope, in your view, this GPP?
But potentially so. I mean, it depends who the end user is, generally speaking. I mean, if the end user is a UK consumer, then they're likely to be in scope. And I think that sort of messaging has been in a couple of the questions. It is coming back to who's the end user of this product, and who is the UK regulated entity who's touching that process, because sometimes products may be coming from abroad, but if that's the case, the expectation would be far more on the UK regulated entity.
Okay. I'm sorry to rush you. Do we have a view, panelists, on whether the consumer duty has to a large extent, or to some extent, superseded the 5 conduct questions in terms of the FCA's expectations. Conduct questions, I think that you're referring to the wholesale 5 conduct questions that are asked every other year, I believe. There is that. What are panelists' viewpoints on that?
I mean, the 5 conduct questions has always amused me because, as you say, it was in the wholesale market, and that was pretty much the only time the regulator actually articulated fully what conduct risk was or what they thought it was, in the wholesale market. I mean, certainly, if downstream a product is going to end up in the hands of the consumer, then there would be scope. I think the consumer duty is absolutely sort of adding to it, expanding on it, and yes, I think superseding what was said there. This is the new world going forward.
Final thoughts. How do firms go for, what do firms need to do to get from where they are to where the regulator wants to get them to, Frank? What does that look like in your viewpoint, to Adrian?
I think the big one for me, and we've sort of reflected on it quite a lot, is the kind of making it real within the organization, which reflects the culture question. If you can get all your troops pointing in the right direction and believing in this campaign, then you can achieve what is a pretty tight deadline. But without that, it is not going to be effective at all.
Adrian, evidence.
Culture. How are you going to measure? Well, what is the program that you've got to change the culture of your business? And culture happens when, managers turn their back, or whatever that lovely phrase was. Yeah, culture is what happens every day. Yeah. So what are you doing? And to do that, you've got to get a handle on your people, their competence, genuine, authentic handle on it, measure it, and change it. That some firms will fail to achieve.
Is this the first webinar where we haven't actually gone over an hour? If so, shall we just hang on for a second? Thank you so much, everybody, for participating. We do promise to give you the slide deck, as Adrian said, as well as actually answer your questions there. If you do have any questions either for Adrian and also Frank, then we'll post their details out to you so you can directly message them there. Thank you very much indeed for making this one of our most popular webinars as well. And if we can support you in any shape or form, please do let us know. Have a great afternoon. Thank you very much.